I was 11 when strangers came to our valley to look for monkeys in the rocks. That's what Maya called them, monkeys, as if they might climb down from the olive trees and steal the laundry. She always said it with a sly smile, like she knew exactly how to tease me. Omicron iota mu alpha mu Omicron delta epsilon, Yanni, she'd say, wagging her finger at me. Keep your eyes open. But the strangers weren't chasing living monkeys. They were chasing a ghost with teeth thick as olives and a name that sounded like something you would whisper in church, Ouranopithecus. The sky ape. The one that, they told me, might say something about us. I can still feel that summer on my skin, the dust of it, the orange sun that slid down over the hills slow as honey. The cicadas were loud enough to rattle your skull if you stood by the pines too long, and the air smelled like thyme and goat and sometimes river mud when the wind came up from the Axios. We lived on the road that cut between fields of tobacco and cotton, the long leaves hanging like fish from nets. The road had potholes my uncle swore were older than he was, and the bus rattled over them with a noise like pots clattering. On the first morning, I saw the team's little convoy glittering at the top of the dirt lane, dust lifting like prayer smoke behind them. There were two tiny cars, the kind that looked always about to sneeze, one green, one white, and a truck with the bed piled high with sacks and crates and a rolled canvas like a sleeping snake. When they stepped out, they blinked at the sun and stretched their backs and patted their pockets for cigarettes. They wore hats with wide brims that made them look like pictures I'd seen of old explorers, and their trousers were stained with chalky patches. They laughed too easily for how hot it already was. It was 8 in the morning, and the cicadas had already started their chorus. Kappa Alpha Lambda Eta Mu Rho Alpha, shouted the woman in sunglasses, cupping her hand around her mouth like a trumpet. We are here for the ravine. Out of her mouth, the Greek sounded careful, like stepping stones placed one by one. Ravin, said a man beside her, smiling under a ridiculous mustache that curled at the ends. Ravin de la Pluie. The Gully of Rain. That man was called Bernard. The sunglasses woman was Dr. Eleni. Later I learned that when the French team first saw the trench in the hillside carved by winter water into the chalk and clays, they named it for the little storms that came in spring and cut the earth open again and again. In our village, we didn't give ravines names, except maybe bad ones when the goats slipped. But I liked how the words sounded together, Ravin de la Pluie. Like a place where stories fell. On that first day, the sun felt like a staring eye, but the air was the kind of dry that makes you feel thirsty just looking at the hills. My mother was already at the sink, washing dishes, her arms wet past her elbows. She saw me standing on the door's threshold and flicked water at me with a grin. What are you doing, Yanni? The narthex of the church is not here. Either come in or go out. Mama, I said, the monkey people are here. She did not laugh at that. She dried her hands and went to the door and squinted toward the road. The paleontologists, she said, in the proud way you say the whole word when you know the meaning. My mother had words like other mothers had recipes. She taught at the school when the headmaster traveled, and when she spoke the names of long ago things, she made them feel like pieces of bread she could pass around. Go, Yanni, she said, but remember polite. Listen twice before you talk. I put on my sandals and ran. There was always running, that summer. I ran across the yard with its fig tree sweating sweet smell and the strangest bees buzzing too slowly. I ran past the chicken pen where the rooster eyed me like a policeman. When I reached the lane, I slowed, because I wanted to look as if I walked everywhere and saw everything as the rightful inspector of my valley. Up close, the strangers were more awkward than from far away. A tall guy fumbled with the strap of the canvas. Another held a map like a priest holding a sermon, carefully unfolded as if not to tear the paper. None of them looked up until my shadow fell on the white chalk line of their shoes. Calimera, I said, as my mother had taught me with my head straight and my voice not too loud. Do you need help? The sunglasses woman took off her glasses. Her eyes were lighter than mine, a sort of hazel that turned green at the edges. She had hair like a cloud, not because it was curly, but because it refused to be one thing. We need friends, she said. Does that count as help? I am Yanni, I said. Maya said you were here for monkeys. Apes, corrected the mustache man, and then he added in Greek, ape, pi theta eta kappa omicron dot. He flashed the word like a card. But, fossils. Very old apes. We do not take any monkeys from your trees. I nodded gravely and tried to look like the kind of person who would never confuse old apes from new monkeys. We don't have any monkeys, I said. Only cats that pretend. They laughed, not unkindly. The tall guy folded the map and offered me his hand. I am Marco, he said, in Greek with a heavy accent that made my name sound like neat letters cut from paper, Ya-N-I. They smelled like dust and coffee and a sweet chemical I would later learn as the breath of the glue they used to keep bones from crumbling. They had stiff pockets, and their hats had been sweated into shape. They wore short-sleeved shirts with 1,000 little pockets and bandanas tied loosely at their necks, though it was too early to be that hot. Are you from Thessaloniki? I asked them. I knew the city like a dream you have about a place you never really see. We went there once a year for my mother to buy shoes and my uncle to argue about fishing rights with his friend, who sold radios and seemed to always be counting money. From everywhere, said Bernard, spreading his hands like the horizon. From Thessaloniki, from Athens, from Poitiers, from Paris, where are you from, Marco? Marco shrugged helplessly. From the place between coffee and cigarettes, he said, and they all laughed again. I walked in front of them at the ravine like a tour guide, pointing out the fig tree that grew like it had a secret to share, the pile of stones where lizards did their push-ups, the smell that the wind made into something you had to taste even if you didn't want to. The ravine was cut into the hillside as if some giant had dragged his fingertip along the earth when he was bored, and the ridge above it was made of chalk and clays and a crust like old bread that broke under your sandals. That day, the light was the kind that made your eyes feel like glass. When we reached the edge, they all stopped and looked as if they'd been told a story they didn't quite believe yet. The ravine was only about as wide as 3 cars laid side by side, and the bottom was a ribbon of dry pebbles and cracked mud. Scrubby bushes clung to the slopes, their roots like threadwork going down into the pale earth. A few spiky plants had purple flowers that looked like the heads of popped matchsticks. Ravine, said Bernard, savoring the sound. De la pluie, he added, pointing at the zigzag where water sometimes ran. He spat into the dust and watched the wet circle appear and vanish. They set to work then, in that way I came to recognize, not all at once, but with the exactness of people who have packed their bags the same way, repacked them, and then dreamt of the packing at night. First they measured, walking along the top of the ravine with a tape measure that made a song when it was pulled out and snapped back. They put in stakes with red kite tails of ribbon, and then they strung a grid with string tied so tight that my fingers itched to pluck it like a guitar. The grid made invisible squares into visible ones, which made me feel like they had called something into being. They brought out shovels with short handles and shiny spades and little trowels that looked like cake knives. They had brushes in cans and spoons and even little dental tools with tiny hooked ends. One of them set up a tripod and climbed it with a notebook, looking through a brass thing with a sight that he wiped with a cloth. That came later, when they wanted to say exactly where things were, down to the finger width. For now, they started to scrape, careful, at the places where the bank of the ravine had a different color, a layer changed, a seam that a river a million years ago laid down in a sigh. I learned the smell of that earth right away. It was metallic and chalky and wet even when dry. It got under your nails and then stayed there like newsprint. Their brushes made a particular sound that I came to love, a shushing side rhythm as if they were petting a sleeping animal into being. They talked quietly, mostly in French and Greek and a little English, as if loud noises might break what they were hoping to find. "You watch," said Eleni, crouching down beside me until we were both on our haunches. "First we clear the surface. We see the layer. We look for shapes that are not rocks." "How can a rock be not a rock?" I asked. "You will see," she said. "Bone looks back at you." And it did. The first thing they found was a tooth, not human, of course, but still even I could see from the way it had a different shine. Marco was the one who saw it. He stopped scraping and then he stopped breathing, and then all of them leaned in as if a well had opened and they wanted to fall. The tooth looked like a little hill, the top of it like a chewed piece of bread. Eleni put her hand around it and whispered something like a spell, only it was just counting, 1, 2, 3, before she put a drop of something on it that smelled like the inside of the medicine cabinet. "Consolidant," she said to me without looking up. "It keeps it together so it doesn't fall apart." "Hipparion," said Bernard, glancing at the grooves in the chewing surface. "Horse." He smiled at me. "But an old kind," he said. "Three-toed." He held up 3 fingers, but then waggled them. "Not like our horse now. But family, you see." I did. I saw how they looked at a tooth and saw a tree, with branches that reached out and touched other branches and crossed the sky. And then I saw through the corner of my eye the way the sun pushed shapes into the world, how a shadow leaned, how a lizard's tail made a line on the dust. I felt like my own bones had become part of the place, like if Eleni brushed me careful enough I might reveal something about the valley. They wrapped their find with small strips of cloth dipped in plaster, and as it hardened, the tooth disappeared inside a white shell that looked like nothing anyone would keep. "We will open it in the lab," Eleni said, making a small note in her book with a stub of a pencil she seemed to like more for its stubbiness. "We will measure, compare. We will speak with the others. But today, yes, we have a tooth." By noon, the heat had grown heavy, and the air felt thick, like a mouth before a sneeze. I ran to the spring to fill their bottles, the water cold enough to make the skin on my hands ache. The spring came out of the hill in a little trickle through a rusted pipe, and the concrete trough around it was green slick with algae. I pressed my face there anyway when no one was looking. On the way back, I saw goats perched in impossible places, like notes on a music staff, and the shepherd whistled without moving his lips. He wore his black cap down low, and his shirt was mended in neat stitches at the elbows, an art I had watched Maya do at night under the yellow light. "Yanni," called Maya from our yard when she saw me trotting with my cheeks puffed and 3 bottles under my arms. "Tell the monkey people to eat. They will faint into a hole and then what will we do?" I nodded. I loved that my family fed everyone who breathed the same air. The table pulled out like an accordion and then people kept appearing, neighbors, cousins, friends of cousins, and if there was not enough bread, someone sliced it thinner and there was enough. That day, my mother set out tomatoes that smelled the way the sun tastes, and cucumbers with sharp little prickles still on their skins, and white cheese that crumbled like chalk in your mouth but held together until it did. She poured olive oil in the dish and the light made a gold window. We had fried eggplant and a pan of greens that my mother had chopped until they were ribbons. Eleni ate with an appetite that made her seem more real, as if food anchored her to the ground she worked. My uncle came, too, with a bottle of Retsina and a man I didn't know. They both sat under the broad grapevine where the chickens hid from the heat and waved their hands in the air when they talked. "You're taking our bones," my uncle said to Bernard, not unkindly. "Next you will take our stones. Then our goats." Bernard laughed. "We leave your goats," he said, holding up his hands. "We take only the ones that died 8 million years ago. They don't mind." My mother glared at my uncle, that look that said men. Please. But she was curious, too. When she set the bread down, she leaned in. 8 million? How can you know? You count the rings. Eleni wiped her mouth and thought for a minute. "We don't have a clock that goes back that far," she said. "But the earth keeps lists for us. The layers tell us. The animals tell us. When the three-toed horses are here, we know where we are roughly. We also can look at how the Earth's magnetic field left little records. It is complicated." My mother nodded in a way that said, "I like when things are complicated and I will ask about it later, when children are asleep." "And the ape?" I said, unable to keep the word inside me any longer. Ouranopithecus, said Bernard, making the word into a beat on a string. "He is called that because in Greek Ouranos, the sky, and Pithekos, the ape. He is from your land." He said it like a toast. Macedonensis. "We named him that before my mustache was this big." "Is he our grandfather?" I said, half serious, half hoping to shock them. I could not stop thinking that if our valley had an ape, and if that ape had teeth, and if those teeth were found by us, then maybe my own teeth were part of that long chewing of the earth. Eleni tilted her head at me. "Maybe a cousin," she said. "Maybe the cousin of our cousins. Scientists argue about it. Sometimes all together, sometimes in journals. But it is all right to not know, especially about very old things. We look carefully, and we say what we see. None of us were there with cameras." Marco wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "He had thick enamel," he said in Greek, carefully, one word at a time, on his molars. Then he smiled like he'd done a trick. "We think he ate harder things. Like Maya's bread when it sits 2 days, I said, and everyone laughed, even Maya, who slapped the table and said, "Go, monkey boy, fetch more water if your words make you thirsty." That afternoon, the shadow of the fig tree made the yard feel like the inside of a cup of tea. I walked with Eleni and Bernard back to the ravine, and the air seemed to turn the color of a peach, like it sometimes does when the light is wrong and you think it might rain out of nowhere. It did, later, but that day, the sky only teased us, the kind of sky that makes the old men point with their chins and say, "We will see." I watched them work until my legs buzzed like the cicadas. The ravine gave little things at first, fragments of antelope leg bones smooth as river rocks, the tips of crocodile scutes like little shield bosses, a turtle plastron one of the students picked up and held like a broken bowl. You could tell when they were excited because they stopped finishing all their words and started jigsawing sentences together. They talked about sand grains and where they came from and how fast the water might have moved. When they found a little skull of a rodent, the room in their eyes changed. It was like they could see the thing's whiskers moving, sniffing the world it used to live in. I was not just watching. It happened slowly, but by the second week, I was part of their day. Someone needed string. I would run. Someone needed the broom. I knew exactly where it had been left. I could draw straight lines with the chalk that didn't break, and I could write labels so they didn't smear. Eleni taught me to print numbers neatly and then to write the name of the layer, and I practiced until my hand thought it had always known. "You are a good student," she said. "Your mother must be proud." "She is," I said, not needing to check. "Do you want to learn the bones?" she said one morning when we had sat in the shadow of the ravine to rest, our backs against the coolness of the bank. She turned her hat upside down and tipped a handful of fragments into it like seeds. "Here is a bit of horse, here antelope, here maybe a pig. See how the teeth this grinding surface look in each? How the enamel makes shapes." I squinted and tried to find difference in sameness. It was like looking at 3 different alphabets and trying to read them all at once. But she had patience that made my thoughts stretch like a cat and then settle. She showed me how to see not the fragment but the animal in it. "We rely on teeth," she said, tapping one gently with a finger the color of olive oil. "They are little stones that remember what the mouth did with them. They are harder than bone and they keep details when the rest is lost. If you find a tooth, you might find who you are looking for." "An Ouranopithecus has big teeth," I said, remembering the way Bernard had held his fingers apart like he was measuring zucchini. "Thick, yes," she said. "Big is not always the story. Thick enamel, the crown's shaped a certain way. And the jaw, if we get lucky, the shape of the mandible, the way the roots of the teeth are placed. But we will not say it is him just because we want it to be him. We have to let it tell us." I nodded. I liked the way she said "let it tell us," like the fossils had little mouths. I imagined their voices as very deep, like the men in church. The men in the Cafagno were not especially pleased by the fossil voices, though. In the afternoons, if I had to go down to buy cigarettes for my uncle, whatever he had joked about the ape, he smoked like a locomotive. I would pass the open door. The air inside was blue with smoke and the sound of the little backgammon checkers clicking on the board. Someone would always call, "Yanni, come, tell us what the French want with our dirt," and I would roll my eyes and pretend to be adult. "They want to understand the past," I'd say. "They want to write papers." I would say paper as if it was a priceless delicacy. "You'll see," said Mr. Tassis one day, slapping a checker down with such force it jumped off the board. "Next they will tell us we are apes. That our grandmothers had tails." "My grandmother can throw a stone farther than you," I said evenly, which was both true and the right kind of impolite. He grinned, his mustache stained the color of coffee. "Opa," he said, and the men laughed, not because the joke was good but because it kept them in the same room with one another. At home, Maya shook her head when I told her. "They are foolish," she said, pounding dough. "We are dust, and to dust we return. But the dust keeps stories. Let the scientists sweep." "They say the ape is maybe our cousin," I said, trying it out again in my mouth. "Like cousin of cousins." "All the world wants to be a cousin," she said, scraping flour from the edge of the bowl with the edge of her hand. "We are family to olives and to goats and to clouds. Why not to ape too? It changes nothing. We still must bake bread." That was her way. You could put the entire world on the table, and she would slice it and give you a piece and tell you to finish what you started. One afternoon, the sky went dark before it should have. It was not a storm like the ones that build up quietly and then clap their hands to wake the valley. It was one of those sudden fits, like the sky remembered something and took it back. The wind came from the wrong direction first, sharp and hot like someone had opened an oven the size of a hill, and then it shifted, as if it had changed its mind, and there was a breath of coolness that made every hair stand on my arms. The cicadas went silent all at once. I didn't know until that moment that their noise is what made the quiet feel like a whole. Bernard looked up and said something rude in French I did not understand, and the team moved like they had practiced it in a dream. They covered the open spots with plastic and weight, rocks, and sandbags that were just sacks filled with the same dust. They tied the string down tight, made sure the stakes were not going anywhere, and then as if someone had flicked a switch the rain was there. It came with a fury that was almost silly, like a man who has been mild for years and then suddenly shouts. The first drops were the size of olives and left puffs of dust. Then there were too many to count, and the sound was like someone shaking a basket of nails. We stood under the fig tree and then under the grapevine, and then, when it became clear that nothing with leaves would help, we went inside. The rain on the roof was so loud it made my chest buzz. The yard turned to chocolate, the rich kind from Athens that you have to lick slow because your tongue can't keep up. In 5 minutes, the ravine became a river. Water moved down its crooked spine, carrying twigs and little stones and a plastic bag and half an egg carton. It was like watching the earth remember it was younger. Ravin de la pluie, indeed, Eleni said, her hair stuck to her face in little commas. She looked at me and laughed. That's how it got its name. Every year, the rain cuts deeper. Sometimes it gives us a little gift. Sometimes it steals. All we can do is work between. The next morning after the storm, the air felt rinsed, as if someone had changed the sheets on the sky. Everything was bright in a way that made your eyes ache and then love it. We walked down to the ravine careful so as not to leave sliding footprints. The dirt was the kind of sticky that grabs at your sandals and tries to take them. You have to walk with a particular kind of foot, the way a cat does when it doesn't like something but has decided to do it anyway. Bernard went first, then Eleni, then me, then the others picking their way like birds. It was true what Eleni had said. The rain had bitten a new angle into the bank. There, in a fresh slice in the earth, something shone just a little differently. You had to squint and look with your face relaxed. There, she said. Do you see? At first, I didn't. Then I did. The thing had a curve to it, a curve that was not accidental. It had the color of bone that has sat politely for a long time, not white, not yellow, but that old beige like a memory of bread. It was the edge of a jaw, a little piece, but with a tooth holding on, root buried in the earth. I made a sound I had not heard before out of my own mouth, a cross between a laugh and a prayer. I think, said Eleni, in the voice people use when they don't want to wake someone, that this might be something we are looking for. They moved with intense slowness. The rest of the world shrank to the small square of dirt touching that fossil. A little scratch. A tiny brush. A drop of consolidant. The smell of acetone floated up like the ghost of a lemon. A sigh. The little tooth bigger than a human tooth, wider, with bumps on the chewing surface that were not random. I did not know what it meant, I could not say yes, it is him. But the adults did not fight the smile that kept trying to happen on their mouths. They worked around it for hours, making a little pedestal, leaving it proud of the earth around it like a little island. Then they put wet plaster bandages around it, carefully, like swaddling a baby. I watched the white cloth turn hard and felt a ridiculous urge to apologize to the fossil for covering it again. But then I saw the look on Eleni's face, and it was like watching someone hear a song only they could hear. We will know more in the lab, she said, trying to sound casual, and failing. Bernard clapped her shoulder and said something quiet that made her eyes shimmer. The days that followed were lit from the inside. The whole team moved like people who had forgotten what being tired feels like. The little finds kept coming: teeth, bones, fragments of shell, each one a word in a sentence they hoped to read. They sometimes worked until the bats began to flicker out from under the tile of our roof like the negative of birds. We ate late and laughed easily and sometimes fell asleep with dirt in our hair. I learned things without knowing I was learning them. That if you hold a jaw in your hand and tap your finger along the teeth, you can feel the pattern of wear and guess what it chewed. That the tops of molars have names, cusps, and that their arrangements are like little maps you can memorize. That if you look at the surface of the ground long enough, the little differences become huge enough to grab you by the collar. That if you find a tooth and want to keep it safe, you should wrap it in tissue and then in a cloth and then in a little box, and then you should write the number twice, once on the box and once on a tag tied to the thing, because paper sometimes forgets. I learned the names of the hills beyond our valley in a new way, not because they had new names but because I knew what lay under them. My mother once told me that people who know wine can taste the soil and the sun and the mood of the day the grapes were cut. I felt that about our land, suddenly, that I could taste the animals that had walked where I walked before we were even an idea in the dirt. When school started, I sat with my face pointing at the window. The headmaster droned about grammar and the proper way to address a letter to a government official, and my pen doodled grids and little bones along the margins of my notebook. After class, the Ouranopithecus, the man from the municipality, pulled Eleni aside and pointed at the papers with a stern look that was more habit than conviction. "The permits," he said, and she smiled the kind of smile that made the most stubborn man feel his shoes had become 2 sizes too big. At night my mother listened to the radio while she did the laundry in the bathtub, the foam making little mountain ranges. The voices coming out spoke of elections and men with names too big to pack into our kitchen without crowding out the goat's cheese. In October, the village squares were a wildfire of green and blue and white flags, and the men shouted each other's heroes' names and then shook hands anyway. We listened to the votes counted one by one, like beads clacking. I watched the team gather in our kitchen, roots and foreigners alike, drinking tea because we had no beer, their faces lit by the dial of the radio, the glow green like underwater. "What do you think?" my mother asked Eleni, as if the two of them had not been this close 1,000 times before, sharing the sink. Eleni shrugged. "Politics is like biostratigraphy," she said. "You squint and you think you see the layers. But sometimes it is just a crack. You always speak as if everything were made of bones," Maya scolded, "but without heat. We need bread, women. Bread, and less shouting." During those fall weeks I went to the ravine every day I could, took the bus when the team went to the city to work in the lab. The lab was a wonder to me. It occupied a corner of a small office in the museum, its windows too high and dusty. There the plaster jackets were opened like eggs being carefully peeled, and the dirt around the fossil cleaned with needles under a magnifying glass that made everything huge and a little strange. The tools were delicate and fierce, a little micro drill that whined like a mosquito, soft brushes that made whispers, bottles with long thin nozzles for the consolidant. The smells were glue and old books and coffee that had been reheated too many times. In that light, the jaw they had taken out from the ravine that morning became something like a small mountain range. The molar sprouted like a peak, its little hills cusps arranged in such a way that you could compare. Eleni showed me drawings of teeth in a book that had the air of someone else's memory to it. She put the jaw fragment on a foam tray, and my breath caught when it moved even a fraction. I wanted to grab it and run, not to steal it, but because it seemed wrong that it could be there and ours. My fingers itched to touch, but I kept my hands on my knees. "Is it?" I said, letting the words come slowly so I wouldn't startle them. Is it him? Eleni drew a line with her finger in the air, tracing the outline of the tooth without touching. You see the thickness here, she said. And the shape. There are other apes here in Europe, but this, it looks like him. It looks like Ouranopithecus. Bernard bent in, his mustache tickling his lip. We will check. We will not say until we are sure. But, he added, a grin crawling across his face like a shadow, it will be a good paper. They argued, which is not the right word because you can argue and be mean and you can argue and be married and lovely. They did the second kind. It was about words, mostly. What could they say? What did the molar measure? How did it look compared to the ones in the drawer already? They used words like hominin and pongin that sounded to me like a song from far away. I stared at the tooth and tried to imagine the mouth that had used it, the lips, the tongue, the way it had chewed. I was hungry suddenly. My stomach made a ridiculous noise, and Eleni laughed like wind through reeds. These words, she said softly to me, with a look over her shoulder to make sure the others would not pounce, they are about who is related to whom. About whether this ape sits closer to us on the branch or closer to the orangutan or the gorilla. People have ideas. But the truth is, there were many kinds of apes then. Some of them are our family, some are cousins of cousins. No one is alone on the tree, Yanni. That is the trick. People like to picture a ladder, and themselves at the top. But it is not a ladder. It is a tree. Maybe even a bush. And the top is just the end of our branch. I pictured the tree in my mind, and for the first time, it did not look like school or like a poster. It looked like the fig tree in our yard, with branches that twisted and crossed each other and bore fruit where you did not expect it. And there, toward the thick trunk but still out on a branch, a little label, Ouranopithecus. My chest lifted like I had been told we had a new neighbor. The winter moved in slowly. It is not like the mountain villages that get snow like a blessing. Our part of Macedonia would sometimes put a white line on its shoulders, but mostly it just let the cold slip under the door and is into our beds, where it tucked itself around our knees and made us shiver. I didn't mind. The cold made the mornings clear like a bell. The ravine let go of its hold on green. The team, some of them, went back to their universities for the holidays. Bernard left with 3 boxes wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, and I watched him put them gently in the back seat like sleeping children. Guard them with your life, I said, half a joke, all truth. With my mustache, he said, tugging at it, and Eleni said, no, with the papers. Make sure customs doesn't, no, never mind. Just keep the papers. And send me a letter. He bent down and squeezed my shoulder like he was checking to see if I was made of the same stuff as the hills. You are a good kid, he said. You could be one of us. My mother says I have to be many things, I said. Because we live in many friends. He laughed and kissed both my cheeks, and then he was gone. The nights grew longer. The oil lamp flickered, and the light made shadows that moved like slow fish across the wall. My mother read me parts of books I didn't understand yet, not because she wanted me to repeat them but because she liked the sound of the words. She read poems about fruit and knives. She read the Cyclops story where the men clung to the sheep's bellies, which made my ears snort that men always cling to sheep and call it heroism. She read from a new book that she kept in a plastic bag to keep the fig fragrance out of it, a thing about how the earth's crust moves. My uncle snored and then snored again, louder, and my mother shook her head and said, he must be exhausting himself. Sometimes my father called from Germany on the black phone with the heavy dial you had to spin with your fingertip, the little hole biting into the skin. He worked in a factory I could never quite picture, a place that made parts of other things, as if there were workshops that only made ears and later a head would be added somewhere else. He talked about weather, about the price of oil, about the football club, and then about me. "Are you good?" he said. "Do you listen to your mother? Do you grow?" "I am learning about apes," I said, daring myself. My father was silent for a second, then laughed softly. "Monkeys," he said, using the wrong word and making me want to correct him and not do it at the same time. "There are monkeys in Germany too. They wear suits and sign papers. I am learning about bolts. Maybe we will trade." He made it a joke, but in that silence before the laugh, I had felt an ache, the kind you get when a tooth is not quite right. He had left for money like men do, and he loved me and my mother, and he thought about us. He was my father, and yet he was also a person who did not live in my house. I went back to the ravine the next day and rubbed the dirt between my fingers and thought about ways things are connected without touching. "He is doing what he believes is right," my mother had said when he left, and I had believed it, and I believed it now, but it was knowledge like a cold pebble you keep in your pocket, comforting but unchanging. Spring again. You could feel the earth flipping her bed and smoothing it down. The rains came and then left. The thyme burst into purple flowers that made the bees drunk. The asparagus was thin and green, like little spears, and my mother cooked it with egg and lemon in a way that made new parts of my mouth wake up. The team returned, not all at once but in dribs and drabs, like a flock that has to remember how to be a flock. Bernard arrived with a thinner mustache and a stack of photos. Eleni had a new hat she pretended to hate. Marco had given up on Greek and then somehow in his absence learned to swear in it. They brought news too, neat and messy. The jaw fragment, cleaned, measured, compared, was indeed what they thought, a piece of Ouranopithecus. They had photographed it until it begged for a break. They had arguments with men in rooms full of glass cases about whether this cusp was this or that and whether that meant this. "I think both," said Eleni wearily, in our kitchen, drinking coffee that she stirred even though the sugar had all dissolved. "I think what we can say is what we see. That the tooth is thick, the molar's shape matches those we have, that it fits the others. We cannot say more. But it is enough." "It is enough," I said, and was surprised to hear my voice be that steady. They had been to other sites too. One in the hills north, where the shrubs made your shins bleed if you were not careful with your steps. Another near a field where a man grew olives that tasted like the sea. The names of the places were part code and part poetry. Ravin de la Pluie, they still called ours, because the French had put their tongue on it first, and the name had stuck like burrs. I liked it. My classmates liked it too. They said it with jokes in their voices and then came down to see if they could spot a fossil like spotting a fish in a stream. Mostly they saw stones, but once, Pand Ellis, who could draw horses so they looked like they were breathing, found a gazelle horncore, and for a week he strutted like a peacock. We made more plaster jackets and filled more little bags. My handwriting grew smaller and more careful. We ate oranges that dripped down our wrists. We sweated and forgot to drink and then drank and felt like we were being invented again. Some days we found nothing but old turtle shells and bits of rib. Some days a tooth like a pebble would turn out to be a word in the sentence we were writing. Every day had its pace. The trick, Eleni said, was to not let the days when luck stood in the shade instead of the sun dull you. Once, the municipal policeman came. He was a man with eyebrows like a bird's legs and a belly that tested the buttons on his shirt every day just to see who would win. He had a little leather pouch he wore under his arm. He carefully took out papers and put them on a flat rock as if he wanted to make a point that his paper was more important than our dirt. Eleni put our papers next to hers in a plastic envelope that was cloudy from use. "You must be careful," he said. "The school children will come. They will scrape. They will fall." He spoke like a man burying the idea of exercise, shovelful by shovelful. "We are careful," Eleni said. "We keep the cafanyo filled with stories. Then the children will sit there and listen. They will not fall." He frowned as if this answer offended him by being both correct and delicious. "And the bones," he said. "Where do they go?" "They are from our land." "To the museum," Eleni said. "To the museum in Thessaloniki, in Athens sometimes, to museums where they will be safe and studied and then brought back to be shown. They are still your lands. We just carry them up the hill and then down the hill and then put them in a drawer where rain will not eat them." Maya brought out a bowl of olives and a plate of cookies and placed them on the flat rock gently, and the policeman forgot his papers for a while, which was the point of cookies. He left, eventually, and Eleni took a long breath and let it out slowly. "People worry," she said, "more to the air than to me. They worry that we will take something. But we are not treasure hunters. We are treasure listeners. We pick up bits and we listen." That night, perched on my bed with the little lamp still talking to the mosquitoes, I thought about treasure. How sometimes it is bright and shiny and sometimes it is a piece of old tooth with a stain of earth the color of coffee. I thought about the stories the old men tell and how we lean in not because the story is always true but because it is what keeps us family. I thought about our sky ape and how he had eaten something, a nut, a root, and how his jaw had moved in a way different from, and yet related to, the way my jaw moved when my mother handed me a scrape of bread with oil and oregano. I fell asleep with little pictures in my mind, images of molars and hills and the way the river drew maps. Sometime in early summer a new man came with the team, a scientist from somewhere I could not pronounce right even if I bit down on my tongue while trying. He had eyes the color of walnut wood and a jaw like a man who chews his pencil when he is thinking. He had read a paper and wanted to see the place where the others had found the jaw. He was polite to Eleni and crisp with Bernard and kept looking at me like maybe I was an artifact that might make sense of something. He liked words that ended in INE and ID and liked to put his finger on diagrams and say, "As you see." He did something that made me angry even though I knew I should not be angry. He looked at the tooth, measured it, frowned, and said, "I am not convinced." "Convinced," I repeated in my head. It sounded like a suit too tight for a summer day. Eleni did not get angry, but she got quiet in the way that made me think of knives in drawers. "That's fine," she said. "You don't have to be convinced. The tooth will not change because you are not convinced. The measurements are the measurements. The comparisons are the comparisons. We will write. You will write.